At this point, we've talked about the anatomy of a muscle, and we've talked about the fact that a muscle is actually composed of tons of these individual muscle fibers. So when you think of a muscle, you shouldn't think of it as one unit. You should think of it as composed of multiple units. And the way we control our muscles is through neurons. And that's what we're going to talk about today, something called the neuromuscular junction. A muscle without a nerve is useless. And I said that before. And that's where we get into paralysis, right? So one of the worst things that can happen to a person is they can get injured and they can sever their spinal cord, and then they will become paralyzed from that point down. So what do I mean by from that point down? Well, the way our spinal cord is set up is it travels from our brain down our vertebrae, and then there's these things called peripheral neurons, which basically branch off of the spinal cord and go to the different parts of the body. So depending on where an injury occurs, that is going to affect from that point down. So for example, if I sever my spinal cord at my neck, everything below that point will not be able to function anymore in terms of my motor neurons. If I do the same injury, but it's at my waist, it'll just affect everything from that point down. So a neuron is what causes a muscle to move. So when somebody's paralyzed, their muscles are fine. Their muscles aren't the problem. The problem is that the neuron going to the muscle is no longer functioning, so that muscle can't work anymore. A good analogy would be, imagine a light, right? So the light bulb above me right now is shining off light down onto my bald head. And if I were to cut the wire to that light, the light would not work anymore. It's not that the light doesn't work anymore. The bulb, if I pulled that bulb out and put it into another light, it would work. It's that the electrical impulse going to the light is cut off. And that is what happens when somebody's paralyzed. Their muscle still functions. It's just that the neuron that feeds that muscle its stimulus is shut off. You can artificially stimulate a muscle. You may have heard of e-stim before, or electrostim. You might have had that done before if you've ever gone to a physical therapist. An e-stim machine is going to artificially stimulate a muscle. So it's basically a pad that you put onto your muscle, and it sends out these low frequency, they're not high voltage, they're not, you can increase it, but it sends out these impulses, and that will cause your muscle to flex. So if somebody has some nerve injury and they're trying to strengthen their muscle, they can use an e-stim machine to get their muscle going again. And then ideally, their nerve will repair, and then they can get their strength back. So the point I'm trying to make here is that a muscle without a nerve is not going to be functional. You need to stimulate that muscle. It can be done artificially through electrical impulses, like getting electrocuted, or using an e-stim machine, or ideally, it's done with your neuron. So let's talk a little bit about the anatomy of what we call the neuromuscular junction. And it says exactly what it is in the name. Neuromuscular, it's the junction or the point at which a neuron and a muscle meet. It's as simple as that. So there's a couple parts that you need to be familiar with. The first part is called the motor neuron. We have multiple types of neurons in the human body. We have motor neurons and we have sensory neurons. And then we have something called interneurons. We're going to get all into that stuff when we get to the nervous system. But for now, we're just going to focus on motor neurons. And motor neurons are the neurons that leave your brain and go to your muscles to make your muscles move. Sensory neurons go from your body to your brain to tell your brain what's going on. So for example, if I cut myself or I touch something hot, my sensory neuron is going to send that information to my brain so my brain can react. Motor neurons are the neurons leaving your brain and going to your body to make you move. So I drew a little picture here. So you can see this would be a brain. That's a brain. This would be like a bicep muscle here. And what you have is this would be the motor neuron, which is going to go down the spinal cord. It's going to branch off, and then it's going to go to the muscle. So you can see here, I kind of just blew this up a little bit. This would be the motor neuron here, and it's going to branch off, and it's going to what we call innervate the muscle fiber. So it's going to send its impulse to the muscle fiber to stimulate that muscle to contract. So that is the motor neuron. It basically carries the impulse from the brain or the spinal cord to the muscle. On the muscle, we have something called a motor end plate. So there are these areas on the muscle fiber, on the outside of the muscle fiber, which are going to allow for a good interface with the neuron, and it's called the motor end plate. So this diagram here does a pretty good job of showing you what's going on. Down here are the fibers, right? So that's our actin and myosin. This would be one sarcomere here. This would be another sarcomere here. And then on the outside, so this would be the sarcolemma, it bulges out slightly where the motor end plate is, and it allows for an interface with this neuron. And what do you notice about this interface? Well, there's a couple things. First of all, it's got folds, and anytime you see folds, I told you this before, it's going to be for the purpose of surface area. So this area allows for more impulse to be transferred because of those folds. If those folds weren't there and it was just a straight line essentially going through here, there would be way less room for receptors. So these folds allow for more surface area. And what you're going to see here is a whole lot of mitochondria and some nuclei. And if you're wondering why there's mitochondria, it's because this process requires energy. It requires ATP. So in order to keep this thing going, you need a lot of ATP. And where do we make ATP? We make ATP in our mitochondria. So you're going to see our muscles are stacked with mitochondria. And that's because our muscles use a huge amount of energy every time they contract. Okay, let's keep going here. So what else do we see in this image? Well, there's something called neurotransmitters. And we haven't gotten into this yet because we haven't done the nervous system. But neurotransmitters are chemicals which transmit an impulse from one neuron to another or from a neuron to a muscle or a gland. So inside this neuron are these little tiny vesicles which contain the neurotransmitter. So that's what actually triggers the response. We have a bunch of different types of neurotransmitters. Some of them trigger a response, some of them inhibit a response, but in the neuron we have these neurotransmitters and they stimulate the muscle to contract. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. What else do I want to go over here? Well, there's a term I'm going to use called a motor unit. And a motor unit is one neuron and all of the fibers that it stimulates. And this is something that I want to talk about for a moment here. So one thing I hope you understand at this point is that a muscle is made up of many, 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 many fascicles. And those fascicles all contain many, many, many muscle fibers. So we break our muscles essentially into components. And we do that. That allows us to have control over how much force we use in a muscle. So basically, a motor unit would be one neuron affecting multiple fibers. And when that neuron gets stimulated, it stimulates all of the fibers that it innervates. So one muscle is going to have multiple motor units. And the more complex the muscle in terms of movement, the more motor units it's going to have. And I'll hopefully explain that a little better in a moment. And the synaptic vesicles are it's a term you need to be familiar with. They're little vesicles inside the neuron that secrete the neurotransmitter. And the main neurotransmitter that we're going to be talking about in this unit is called acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter that stimulates muscle. Now, there's all different kinds of neurotransmitters in the brain. There's dopamine, there's serotonin. You've probably heard of these before. They do different jobs. So different neurotransmitters stimulate different reactions. And in this case, the one that we're going to focus on in this unit is acetylcholine. And acetylcholine, it does many things in the body. It works differently depending on where it is. In the brain, it does something entirely different. But in the muscle, it stimulates a muscle contraction. And they're contained inside these things called synaptic vesicles, which live inside the neuron, and they get released to stimulate the muscle fiber. So this is just another image. You can see this would be the motor neuron, and you can see it branches off, and it's attaching to different parts of the muscle, so that way it can stimulate different components. This just shows you the synaptic vesicles, which would contain the acetylcholine. This shows you that motor end plate. This is called the synapse, and the synapse is the space between the neuron and the muscle. They don't actually touch. There's a little space there called the synaptic cleft, which allows these neurotransmitters to cross, and they cross over and they stimulate the muscle fiber. So this is just another image of what we just looked at. I like this a lot. This is pretty cool. So what you see here is an actual electron micrograph. So using an electron microscope, this is an actual skeletal muscle. So you can see these are the individual muscle fibers, right? And you can also see the striations, right? Light, dark, light, dark, light, dark. So the light part is the I band and the dark part is the A band of a sarcomere. So I can tell that this is a relaxed muscle. Because it's relaxed, I can tell it's relaxed because it has the I band present. When that muscle contracts, the I band goes away and the muscle contracts. And we'll talk more about that later. But what I also like about this image is you can really see these neurons. So this is a neuron that is branched off. And this is all from the same neuron. So this would be one motor unit because this one neuron is innervating all of these muscle fibers. What else can you see here? Well, you can see the synaptic vesicles, right? Those little dark dots are full of neurotransmitter. And this is where the motor end plate is. So this is where the neuron and the muscle fiber are going to come into contact with each other. So what's going to happen is when this neuron fires off, it's going to make the muscle contract. and that muscle is going to contract. And this motor unit is going to affect all of those fibers. So it would be like if you had multiple lights on one light switch. So let's say in your bedroom you have a light switch, and when you turn it on, it turns on a light and a lamp. That would be like a motor unit because it turns both of those lights on. It doesn't turn all the lights on in the room. You need to turn on another switch for that. You want to control how much light's in your room. You don't want to have one switch that turns on every single light because then it's just like bright or dark. That's how our muscles work. You don't want your entire muscle to fire off every time you want to use it. That brings us back to the video we started this unit with, right? Where that guy threw the rock off of himself. The reason he was able to do that is because all of his motor units got stimulated at once and his muscle fired off where his whole muscle contracted at once. That is not what you want to have happen because that's going to cause damage. You want to control your motor units. So, perfect example, I'm holding my phone right now. I'm not going to hold this with the same amount of strength as I would hold a dumbbell or I would break my phone. So what's causing me to hold it with a different amount of strength is a number of motor units that I'm employing. So right now, I'm not employing very many because it's not heavy. But let's say I were to suddenly pick up a dumbbell. Well, now my brain is going to cause more motor units to get activated and my muscle is going to contract with more force so I can hold the dumbbell. So the amount of force that your muscle gives off is completely related to the number of motor units. A muscle is like a light switch. It's on or off. So a single muscle fiber can't give you a stronger contraction. The way you have a stronger contraction is the number of motor units that get employed. And the more motor units you have, the more control you have over that muscle. So I'm going to finish up with one more idea here. That is the difference between, let's say, your quadricep muscle versus the small muscles in your hand. The small muscles in your hand have way more motor units because you want to have more control over your hand. You don't want to crush a glass when you pick it up. You want to be able to manipulate your fingers in a way that you can control them. Your leg, on the other hand, it's either your muscle flexes or it doesn't. So larger muscles tend to have less motor units because they have one function. They just are on or off. And that's enough for today. Thank you.